Welcome to Legislative Watch. I'm Elizabeth Allan Hodge, your host, and in the studio today I have two special guests from the Idaho House of Representatives. I have Representative Darrell Bolz, who's in his 5th term from District 10 in Canyon County. He's Vice Chairman of JFAC, which is the Joint Appropriations and Finance Committee. He also sits on the Ag Committee and Jude and Rules. His background, I've known him for many, many years as our best county extension agent that we ever had. You could ask him any question and he had the answer. He is also U of I Professor Emeritus at University of Idaho. With him we have Representative Raul Labrador entering his 2nd term in the Idaho House of Representatives. Raul's from District 14, Ada County, and his committees include State Affairs, Jude and Rules, and Transportation. He is a practicing attorney here in Ada County, and his specialty is immigration and criminal law. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Well, Darrell, I want to start with you. This is your 5th term, and you are known as almost a walking encyclopedia of information, and I know that this last summer you came and spoke to a group of people for me, and we were very impressed with all the knowledge that you had. You really do a lot of studying.
Thank you.
I'd like to address JFAC, Joint Finance and Appropriations, especially right now in light of our economy and the budget. Would you tell our listeners where you are with things? And
JFAC's one of those committees that meets every day, starts 8 o'clock in the morning. We spend about 3 hours every day or so going through hearings with the various agency and department. We actually start setting the budget on February 23rd. We have some areas where that JFAC should not be in the policy business, and so we want the germane committees to go ahead and kind of set some policies, and that may have some effect, if not quite a bit of effect, in terms of where we go in some of the budgets this year. Where we stand in terms of going home, it's really a tough question. We don't even know to what number we're setting the budget to at this point in time. We're waiting for finalization to see exactly what the numbers are, but we have not got the final numbers yet. And so JFAC will take consideration of those numbers along with the Revenue Projection Committee and then with the governor, and take a look at all those figures and then try to come up with some sort of a number that we can actually set the budget to at that point in time.
So the leadership's wish at doing a 2-month legislative session probably isn't going to happen.
Well, you know, if I had my druthers, I would hope that we get out of here before the 1st of April. And I say that from a couple of standpoints, because if we stay until the first part of April, April is the largest month in terms of revenue coming into the state because of income tax and this type of thing. And if we hit the 1st of April, my thought is that most people want to stay there until they get the April numbers. And so when you start looking at from that standpoint, I think we'd be there for another 2 to 3 weeks probably. Yeah. And my own personal viewpoint would be, let's get out of here before the 1st of April. And if we have to come back for a 1 or 2 day special session or something, that's still going to be better for the citizens of Idaho in terms of the cost of an everyday session is around $30,000. And so.
So when you come back for a special session, is it still a $30,000 daily?
Pretty much about that cost, yeah. The thing is, why we'd have to come back for a special session is that the governor can do holdbacks, but he cannot make them permanent. And so the legislature has to make those permanent. In fact, we had the 4% holdback that he called for last fall, and we had to make that permanent when we first came in the JFAC, the first thing in January. Well, if we have a downturn in the numbers when we come in with April, if they fall off the edge of the table, so to speak, he has no way that he can really deal with that.
With a constitutional mandate for a balanced budget, you're kind of walking a tightrope on some of this stuff.
We really are, and of course one of the things that JFAC is looking for is to be very, very conservative in terms of the number that we pick, so that we don't end up, on a high side and then have the numbers drop on us in April and then really be in a pickle with it. And so we would rather err on the low side in terms of that number rather than on the high side.
Now, once you start setting the budget, how long does it usually take?
Typically what we're looking at this year, we're starting on the 23rd, and we hope to finish up on March 13th, I believe it is.
Now, when the speaker was here, he talked about the grocery tax credit. How do you take that into account?
Well, the credit you have to look at basically as an expense because the revenue is not coming in. And the grocery tax credit is kind of a unique thing because that was just passed here a year or so ago. And It's a new program because before seniors, if they didn't pay income tax, could not get that grocery tax credit, and they now can apply for that by filling out a form and get that credit now.
Raul, Representative Labrador, this is your second term in the House, and you're sitting on state affairs, and with a background in immigration and criminal law, you're working on campaign reform, and you wanted to talk a little bit about bribery statutes as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I'm working on this year. One of the things is campaign consolidation or election consolidation. The other thing is working on some bribery statutes and maybe some sunshine statutes. One of the issues is that there's a perception outside of the legislature that everybody's a crook, that everyone who works for the legislature, that anybody who's a state legislator, anybody who's a lobbyist is in on the take. And I've actually been really amazed and surprised by the quality of people who work at the legislature. Darrell is one of the finest examples of a human being that I have met. I've met many other people like him, and there's people who are really trying to do a good thing for the people of Idaho. But on the other hand, I think sometimes because there's a little bit of secrecy on what we're doing and who we're meeting with, people are confused about what exactly it is that we do as legislators. And so I started thinking that maybe as legislators what we should be advocating is more sunshine, more availability to the public of the kinds of things that we do. So transparency.
There you go.
Exactly, more transparency. The bribery statute in Idaho, apparently the way it was drafted, is very difficult to go after anybody who breaks the law. So I've been working with the Attorney General's office to try to make sure that the bribery statute is a little bit tighter. So when somebody does commit, when that one or two people who may not be as clean as the rest do actually make some sort of move that is not clean, that we could actually prosecute them.
Are you saying that the way the law is currently written, there's really, it's not tight enough to actually even define what's bribery? And
that's exactly right. The way the law is written right now, the Attorney General's office believes that it's so loose in their definition that a good criminal defense attorney, like myself, for example, would just find a hole in the statute. So even if they wanted to prosecute somebody who had violated the law, or at least who had committed an act that they thought was improper, they can't come after that individual because the law is a little bit too loose. And what we have is a due process issue. If we have a criminal statute, you need to make sure that the criminal statute specifically defines what acts are criminal. And the Attorney General's office has said that the bribery statute does not specifically define which acts are forbidden, which acts are legal, which acts are illegal. So when there's an accusation that somebody has done something wrong, even if it's something that we would all agree is a bad thing, it's not necessarily a criminal act.
So the tough thing is you can have somebody that's a bad player that is an unethical person, but there's no law against being unethical.
Exactly. There's no law against being unethical, and I think that taints the entire system.
You bet.
Because when you have somebody who does something that I think everyone can perceive that it's an unethical thing, but there's no punishment for that unethical behavior, then the public assumes that all of us are unethical, and that's why we're not getting caught.
Absolutely, and that's what's led people to be discouraged relative to the political process. I can't believe the number of people that I've talked to who have said that they don't even vote anymore because nothing changes, and even people who say that they're going to change once they're in office, they want to get reelected, so they're going to go along to get along, so I think that's a real concern that people have. They feel disenfranchised when somebody can clearly see something is wrong morally and ethically, and people are getting away with it, and it's blatant and in your face, and there's nothing that can be done about it. It's very frustrating.
It is very frustrating, and I think it sends the wrong message to the people. So what I really want to do this year is make sure that we can define maybe what unethical behavior is, what criminal behavior is.
And depending on who would be involved in it, different groups have different ways of reporting, especially lobbyists have certain rules that they have to follow, right?
Correct.
And so you've got all of these groups that you have to take into account and how you address them, I imagine, huh?
That is correct. And also who they're dealing with. One of the things that happened a couple of years ago, for example, is that we changed the law to include the executive branch under the definition of lobbying and who's being lobbied to. Well, one of the things I found out in my study of the bribery statute is that they changed the definition of what a lobbyist is, but if you go to the section that talks about the penalties for lobbyists, they did not include actions to the executive branch.
Oh, so they're exempted.
So everyone thought they had changed the law to include the executive branch. Well, they did that just in the definition of lobbying, but not in the penalties section.
Sure.
So now we have to, I'm going to try to change that a little bit. So the action, so something that today is illegal if you do it with a legislator is not necessarily illegal if you do it with a member of the executive.
On our website, we have a link right to the legislative website, and so people can track bills, know what's going on. Will this be in the daily data so that people can be aware of when they're going to have hearings on it?
It should be, and I think we'll have something in a couple of weeks.
More at the other side of the break. I'm Elizabeth Allan Hodge. The program is Legislative Watch. Welcome back to Legislative Watch. I'm Elizabeth Allan Hodge, and in the studio today my guests are Representative Darrell Bolz. We also have Representative Raul Labrador. He's a practicing attorney with a specialty in immigration and criminal law, and we've been talking about bribery statutes. Raul, what first sparked your interest or called your attention to the fact that there needed to be some changes in the statutes?
Well, for the most part, like we mentioned earlier, I really believe that our duty is to have accountability and transparency in government.
Good for you.
And I think that there have been some indications that there are some actions taken by some people that may not necessarily be as transparent or accountable as possible. And I just started realizing that maybe our laws are not as succinct as they need to be and as clear as they need to be. So I just thought it would be a good idea to try to tighten those laws up a little bit.
And you found that once you start tightening one area, there's maybe another area that needs to be tightened, and that's what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. So my little 1 hour project has turned into a session-long project.
Isn't that how it always is? So you've got a draft of some legislation that you're proposing. One of the things we do on our website is we have a link to the legislature so people can track the bills, as we said earlier, and we try and have them come down and get involved, but you're dealing with some limited space right now at the annex there. Darrell, you were talking about the fact that not very many people come down.
We don't have the galleries anymore for either the House or the Senate, and so people really can't view what's going on unless they want to go down the bottom floor and watch it on a large TV screen, and they can do that from home and watch it on public television or whatever type situation. And I think that's probably the biggest downfall that we have during this transition period while we're waiting to get back into the Capitol, that basically, and I think it has a perception to people, and of course perception becomes reality, that the only people there are lobbyists. And so, and I can certainly understand, I think any of us would probably have that concern because you don't have a lot of people around. Because when you get in the Capitol, you have a lot of people, visitors, doing tours of the Capitol, and they can visit with the legislators and actually see what's going on.
Of course, the nice thing is, if they're there, they can attend the committee meetings. But how has that affected you in terms of the room in which you hold your committee meetings? Some of the committee rooms are actually larger than what we had in the Capitol, so they're not as accessible from some standpoints because you got a couple of them on the House side and I think a couple on the Senate side too that have a pillar right in the middle of them, so it's a little difficult to kind of see around sometimes. But some of the rooms actually have a little more room to them than what you had in the Capitol. It's just limited space type situation that makes it pretty difficult. What kind of involvement are you having in your hearings? The committees I'm involved with, it's about the same that we had before. In some cases, might be a little less, but not too bad. Of course, you're dealing with budget items, so I imagine you're probably having a lot from the executive branch checking in on their department. The JFAC, actually, we have less room there than we did over in the Capitol, and so it's pretty tight in there. We only have room for about 12 or so people to be able to sit in there on any of the JFAC hearings, which makes it pretty difficult because you get some of the larger agencies sometimes like to bring more people in to help answer questions and things. There's just not room for them to be there. Okay, Raul, one of the things that you had said that you were interested in was also campaign reform, election consolidation. I know this last year was the first time they really pushed voting ahead of time, not just at the Barrister Street, and I think there was an area here in Meridian as well, mail-in voting. And that has led to some questions. I know of one incident where a gentleman supposedly called in and said, "Why are you sending my wife an absentee ballot when she's been dead for some time now. And another incident where someone said that they found out that the address was owned by somebody that's out of state that isn't even here, and a ballot was actually sent to the address. Can you address that a little bit?
Absolutely. This year we saw something that was unprecedented in the state of Idaho. For the last at least 2 years when I've been in the legislature, and I assume many years before, the Secretary of State's office and the local elections officers had been trying to do what we call vote by mail. They wanted to expand the right of people to vote by mail throughout the state for any reason. And we had rejected that. At least the last 2 years, we rejected it every year. And that was a policy decision that we made in our State Affairs Committee, that we did not want to expand the right of people to vote by mail. So this year, what happened in Ada County is that they decided to expand that right and go against the wishes of the legislature. And they claim that the reason they wanted to do it is in order to give more people the ability to vote. And I don't have any problem with giving more people the ability to vote. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about election reform that's going to give more people the ability to vote, because it's going to be election consolidation. But what this is doing, there are some questions about potential fraud. Because when you allow people to vote by mail, they don't have to appear before anybody. You don't know who's signing the documents. You don't know what's being turned in. And we have some serious concern. And in fact, some of us are looking at potentially even having voter ID required in order to vote. As Ada County becomes bigger and bigger, and as Idaho becomes bigger and bigger, and there's more population in the state, as you know, Elizabeth, a long time ago, when you went to the polling booth, everyone knew their neighbors.
Sure.
The people who were at the polling booth were people who knew who lived in the area. Now we're becoming a much bigger state, which is a wonderful thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think we have some concerns that there are people who may be trying to vote in certain areas where they're not eligible for, or they may be trying to allow other people to vote in areas where they're not eligible.
I know that there was a question raised, too, depending on when the last ballots were sent out, whether a person could even feasibly vote twice by going to 2 different spots. And the fact that they are actually not calling for any identification to make sure that you have this precious right to vote.
Even with this voting system we used this last year, Ada and Canyon County, some other counties went to the scan type of vote. But I saw some problems with this, and I brought it to the attention of our county clerk because of the way that people potentially could have voted. And I know an individual that went in and voted like the day or two before the election, but when we went to the polling place, their name had not been checked off, but they had actually voted.
Exactly.
And so, I think that one of the things that Raul was talking about in terms of either taking and have an ID and or having the election cutoff date far enough in advance so that they can have those records marked so that they know who has voted earlier and who has not voted earlier.
And as you know, in the past, absentee balloting was done because you were going to be absent. That was the whole purpose of absentee balloting, hence the word absentee. So in the past, you had to sign an affidavit that said that you were going to be out of the state or incapacitated in some way, that you were not able to go to the polling booth. All of a sudden, we have expanded the definition of absentee just as for mere convenience. A lot of people accuse me of being, it's just the conservatives who are concerned about this. Well, there was a study done by a foundation, and the co-chairs of that foundation were Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, neither one of whom is known to be a rabid conservative. Yeah. The conclusion of that commission is that vote by mail would lead to fraud, and that it should be something that should be discouraged unless it is for the purpose of absentee voting. And this was not a group of right-wing ideologues who came with this conclusion. It was 2 gentlemen who I think are well respected by all people for the most part, and they really had some concerns because what they noticed is that the expansion of voting by mail would just lead to more and more fraud. And in Idaho, many of our elections are decided by 2 or 3 votes.
That's right.
And the right to vote is such a sacred right. It should be the most important right because it defines everything else that we do in government. The people who are elected by the people are the people who make the decisions in this republic. And if we cannot be sure that...
Thank you for calling it a republic.
You're welcome.
And to the republic. I share your concerns, and I think what you're doing is very helpful. I know that along those same lines on absenteeism, something was called to my attention this last year. Some of the seniors that are in care centers that may apply for an absentee ballot, there was a concern that maybe one individual who was turning them all in was maybe actually casting their vote for them. How do you deal with issues like competency?
You know, I haven't looked at that issue. I think it's an area of concern. And maybe Darrell has looked at that a little bit.
I haven't looked at it. I don't know how you deal with that, but
Yeah.
you could look at that from any standpoint. You know, I always have people that go to the polls that really haven't even studied the candidates and such, and so, you know, that could be as bad as incompetence
Sure,
in a lot of
but this
respects.
is different in the sense that if you have a group of individuals in a unit where they're full-time care, take for instance an Alzheimer's unit, it certainly is possible that they are all receiving absentee ballots and one person casts a vote for all of them. As Raul pointed out, you know, some of these votes are pretty close. And so as we're addressing the whole idea of election fraud or the possibility of voter fraud, I just wondered whether this has been an issue at all, or whether anybody's even addressed it or thought about it.
I think we have thought about it, but I don't know how the law can address that because they do have a right to vote. And we have to make sure that we're not so restrictive that we're taking people's rights.
But if one bad apple were to do something like that, you're taking the rights of all the other individuals who are voting, and even the people who don't know that you're voting for them, if you will.
And I think you hit it right on the head. You hit the nail right on the head there. That is what people don't understand about this issue, is that if fraud is allowed in an election, you're taking away the rights of all the people who properly cast ballots. You're taking their right of voting away. It's not just that there's one fraudulent ballot. It's that if an election is won by fraud, everyone who voted for the person who should have won that election, their franchise has been taken away from them.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad that you're looking into this, and I hope that people will stay on top of that and give you some support and show up and maybe see what's going on. On the other side of the break, when we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Representative Raul Labrador and Representative Darrell Bolz. I'm Elizabeth Allan Hodge. The program is Legislative Watch. Welcome back to Legislative Watch. I'm Elizabeth Allan Hodge, and in the studio today, my guests are Representative Raul Labrador, his second term in the Idaho House of Representatives from District 14, Ada County, and Representative Darrell Bolz, who's in his fifth term from District 10, Canyon County. Prior to the break, Raul, you were discussing voter fraud and changing some of the laws relative to how people vote and bribery statutes. I know you wanted to also discuss election consolidation.
I do, Elizabeth, and I think something that's really important to understand about the issue of election reform is that the people who are trying to expand the right of people to vote by mail, their intentions are very noble. Their intention is to actually have more people vote. I don't think they have any ill intentions in any way. I am concerned that what they're doing is actually going to bring about more fraud, and that's why I'm fighting it. And I want to bring more people to the polls, and that's why I'm so interested in election consolidation. Let me tell you how I got interested in this subject. About 2.5 years ago, I went to my polling booth. I was a first-time candidate, and I had decided that I was going to run for office, and I was really interested in the legislative process and in the election process. So in my city, at the same time that we were holding my elections, we were holding an election for a bond on the fire station. I knew all about the bond on the fire station because I had been attending several meetings, and I even had the chief of the fire department at same meetings where I was discussing my campaign. He had discussed the bond election. So I was very informed about the issue. The problem was that on the day of the election, I could not vote for that bond in my polling booth. After voting in one place, I was supposed to go to the fire station. I was so busy that morning that I completely forgot. It wasn't because I wasn't aware of the election. It was just because it was just one other thing that I had to do that day.
You bet.
So I completely forgot. The following morning after the election, I read the election results, and obviously I was pretty excited because I won. But at the same time, I realized that only 200 people in the city of Eagle had actually voted on the bond, out of thousands of people who voted in my election. And those 200 people raised my property taxes by 5%.
Wow.
I just asked myself, why did we have these elections in two different places on the same day? So when I went to the legislature, one of the first questions I asked is, why do we do this? And I realized that there were legislators who had been working on this issue for many years. And one of them was Dennis Lake. And Dennis Lake had been working for many years on getting election consolidation. So what's election consolidation? It's getting to vote on the same day at the same voting place on all the issues that pertained to your city, to your home, to your community. So, for example, on that day of the election, I could have voted on the fire department bond and my election in the same place.
Yeah.
You know, we see, for example, we see sometimes that there's bond elections on off days. There's bond elections. The school districts right now can have bond elections any day of the year. They have 364 days that they can hold a bond election. Well, why don't they do it on specific dates? So I have in front of me a piece of legislation that is 90 pages long.
Is this a new section?
It's actually not a new section. It's 90 pages long because I don't want people to be afraid of it. It's because there's so many sections of the code that are affected by elections. So it's not 90 pages of new legislation.
Right.
It's just every single area where elections are mentioned in the code, we are changing. But what this law does is there's only going to be 4 election dates every year.
Okay.
It's going to be the primary date, the general election date, and then 2 additional dates for school bond elections because of some issues dealing with when the schools can actually bond, and there are issues that I don't understand very well. The general election date and the primary dates do not work well for them for bond elections. But there's only going to be 2 school bond election dates that are available to them, and the bond elections have to be held on those dates. They cannot use any other dates for that. The other thing that the legislation does is it says that all the elections that deal with your place of residence are going to be held in the same polling booth. So if you have a water district election, a fire district election, library district election, also the regular candidate election, the regular general election, all those things, they are all going to be held at the same place. So when you go to the polling booth, they will ask you, where do you live? And then they're going to have something on a sheet of paper that will say the person who lives at this address has these many ballots that need to be handed to them. And I think it's going to be great because then we're going to have higher participation from all the people in all the different elections.
If I might just make a comment too, that I think what Raul is talking about here in terms of a form that tells what you do. Currently, I can go to my elections office and I can get a CD for my total district, and on that district it has all the registered voters listed, and it will tell you their history of voting for the last 5 or 6 things, but it also lists the school district you're in, what school trustee zone you're in, and all these type of things. So it's not that that information is not available. It is. It's just that we haven't accessed it and used it in terms of doing our elections.
Raul, how is this being accepted by or received by the people that have been working on consolidation?
Well, the legislators are really excited about it. The problem right now has been where some of the school districts and the counties and the cities are concerned about it. There is one major concern, and it may be a problem to get this passed this year. This will come with a cost, and it's a cost of at least $4 million. to the state. And in this, as you have been talking with Darrell about the budget, our budget
that is what you call a fiscal impact.
It will have a significant fiscal impact. And I think that it's a fiscal impact that is worthwhile, because there's nothing more worthwhile than paying for our elections and making sure that we have fair elections.
Yeah.
But in a year like this, as Darrell will tell you, it's going to be very difficult to be able to find this $4 million.
Sure.
Because as Darrell indicated, all this information we have, we've never put it together. So it's going to cost us money to make sure that all that information is put into one system that allows somebody to vote in all those different elections in the same place.
I concur that in the long run, it's one of the best things that could happen in terms of anything that makes the voting experience a proper and good experience and legitimate experience, supports all of the citizens, and that's what you're trying to do, is make sure that we have, accountable government.
Absolutely. And let me make one thing clear. I'm sorry, Darrell, but it's $4 million per year. That's the fiscal impact.
So it's an ongoing
expense.
And the other thing, too, and I may not have the right bill here, because I know there's been some other election consolidation bills, too, but some of the people that I've talked to, some of the county commissioners, they were concerned that some of this expense is also on the county side, and some of the counties, depending upon what happens this next year with decreasing property values, their taxing ability is going to be stressed quite a bit, because they have that 3% cap. And I did have one county commissioner says, I might accept the cost of election consolidation if you do something with a 3% cap.
Well, that's interesting that you raise up something that's probably conversation for another program, but you're saying with property values going down. Of course, I'm a real estate broker, and I've seen a huge decline in property value, but not always is the tax on property commensurate with the declining value. And so that's been kind of problematic, where people are still paying a certain property tax based on a higher assessed value, and yet their property has been assessed $50,000 less, sometimes $100,000 less, and yet they're still paying the higher assessed value. So I'm not so sure that I'm very sympathetic with what he may have been saying to you.
And I understand that. The thing that I see coming down the pike, though, depends upon what the assessors do with that property in terms of how they assess the taxation on it. The critical issue that I look at is we've got a number of school districts that have passed bonds, and those bonds were basically passed under the premise that increasing values of property was going to take care of that, so they would not have to raise the mill levy rate. Well, if the property tax is then assessed at lower, then your mill levy rate's going to go up to keep those taxes even higher.
I just don't see anybody from the county assessor's office running out and checking people's property to see if they need to lower their property value tax. So that's just this person's opinion. All right. So now, Darrell, prior to the show, as we were discussing audits, you were talking about the fact that there's a difference between a performance versus a finance audit. Can you address that for our listeners?
Yeah, I sure try. Anyhow, and this is, I guess, my interpretation and basic what I've heard before from other people and everything, that there are different types of audits. And the basic financial audit is basically where auditors will come in and they will find out whether or not that you are following the prescribed methods of doing your bookkeeping and following the procedures as a way you could. And if you look at an audit, a lot of times there's a cover sheet on the audit, and it basically says that you are following the rules according to the federal guidelines in this type of situation. But a performance audit is a little bit different from my standpoint, because it actually goes in and looks at efficiencies, whereas a financial audit would not look at those efficiencies. It just looks at whether you are following the guidelines as well as you should or not. From what I've seen, I have not had an opportunity to completely read the total transportation audit, but to my understanding it was more of a performance audit, and it was looking for those places where that they might gain some efficiency in doing some things and how they might go about doing their operation, their business and such. And to me, I've always looked at things from, and I'm not pinging on school districts, don't take me wrong here, I'm just looking at school districts a lot of times because I think that they're not the only one. We can look at any entity, and are we actually getting the best performance? How are we doing? And we ought to look at our own lives that way, too. When we take a look at our own bookkeeping, we try to figure out in our own businesses and things, are we doing things the most efficient manner that we could? And just by going through and looking and making sure that we're paying their bills correctly and this type of thing does not really tell us whether we're efficient or not.
I've got to cut you off right there because we're down to the next break, but we'll continue this after the break. Welcome back to Legislative Watch. I'm Elizabeth Allan Hodge, and in the studio today my guests are Representative Darrell Bolz and Representative Raul Labrador. Gentlemen, the general public thinks when you say that there's going to be an audit done, that you're going to find out whether these people are spending their money wisely, whether they're doing things effectively, efficiently, whether they're being accountable, and really that's not necessarily the case. Raul, would you like to address that for us?
Absolutely. Before I came to the legislature 2 years ago, I thought the same thing. Every time I heard of an audit, I used to think there was only a performance audit. I didn't realize that they were doing mostly financial audits. The way I look at it is that a financial audit determines whether, for example, if we spent $100 on a widget, if we spent the $100 on that widget, that's all a financial audit will tell you. A performance audit will actually go deeper into it and will determine whether that $100 was spent wisely, whether we should have spent that $100 in the first place. And we don't do enough performance audits in government. It seems like all we ever do is we do financial audits. We're just telling each other, yes, we gave you permission to spend that $100 on the widget, and the agency comes back to us and says, I spent it on the widget. I'm such a great person.
Now, whether the widget worked
whether the widget worked or not. And what concerns me is that we keep doing all these audits, but we don't see the change in government that I think that people are waiting for.
And let's say that you've got a business, and once a month it's being called to your attention, hey, you know what, the money's not only not being spent right, but some of the stuff that we're buying we don't need or it's not working. You'd say, you know, I can't stay in business very long if I'm not being efficient or effective. Why is that not the case here?
One of the reasons I've given, and I think it's a good, compelling reason, is that they haven't been given the proper tools. They haven't given the money to purchase the tools, you know, that they require to be more efficient.
Raul, I know that there are listeners that are probably screaming at their radio saying, now, wait a minute. Well, what can we afford to do? What kind of changes can we make? We can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That's the definition of insanity, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, so what can be done?
No, I believe that there's a general consensus that we will give them the tools.
I can give you an example of a tool possibly, and let's take health and welfare, for example. One of the problems they have an old, outdated computer system that they use to do a lot of their record keeping with and keeping track of all the people who are in their system. And so they're going to a new system now. Well, with that newer automated system, they have much better ability to keep track of those individuals and to tie in more things, because one of the things that we look at in health and welfare, of course, is how do you tie in these people who are going to 6 or 7 doctors and getting 6 or 7 different prescriptions? Do we have a way that we can bring all of that information into one location and know whether or not that this individual shouldn't be getting those prescriptions, number one, and the cost that it's costing us as taxpayers to do all of that type of thing. So sometimes these kind of tools are things that we haven't been able to keep them updated in some of the systems they need to do. And I'm not saying it's always computers, but that's just one example.
Gentlemen, address whatever you want to talk about. I know that, Darrell, you had wanted to kind of wrap some things up relative to the budget.
Yeah, I guess, Elizabeth, that it's kind of a unique situation. We're in a very, very difficult time right now in terms of the budget, in terms of where we're going to go, not knowing exactly where we are right yet, so to speak, but everybody's going to have to hurt a little bit. We cannot expect one segment of the society in the state of Idaho to take the brunt and share all the hurt for this economic downturn. And so, you know, there's some talk going around in terms of some things that we might do, and one of those is that we may ask all state employees to take a reduction of salary. Whether we do that or whether we go to some days off or whatever, I don't know what we're going to do at this point in time, but it's just a fact that, you know, and it's kind of like when you go to the grocery store, and that's the state that we are here in Idaho. When you go to the grocery store, if you don't have a credit card, and the state of Idaho does not have a credit card, we're not like the federal government. We cannot print money, which is a good thing, okay?
A very good thing.
But when you go to the grocery store, if you pull out your billfold and you've got so many dollars in it, when you spend that, that's all you can spend, okay? And that's where we are in our state budget. We know, or we're estimating on what our revenues are, And that's all we can budget for.
The whole point is when you talk about those dollars, you are talking about the person who goes to the grocery store.
Right. That's right.
Because the dollars that you get are dollars from him.
That's right.
And so I think it's only responsible to say we have to be careful on our expenditures because it's affecting the person that's trying to go to work and make an income for his family. And I know in the private sector as well, there are people that have taken days off, that have had to take cuts in pay. But as long as you're still working and you're still feeding your family, you know, America's a great place to live because of these things. However, once the money's gone, as you said, it's gone. So you have to decide where you're going to put the money and where it's going to do the most good.
Yeah, you know, all of the agency heads have been very, very good. They realize, you know, that we are in desperate times. And when we start looking at the governor's recommendation on some of these agencies, they're looking at for 2010 of being 10 to 15% down from where they are. That's how much they're having to reduce their budgets. And so the final comment would be, you know, I made a comment that everybody has to hurt a little bit. And I think, you know, that people need to understand, because you've got some agencies where 75, 80, 90% of their costs are in personnel costs, okay? So they have no choice. When you get to a certain point of cutting, the only place you've got left is in personnel. And somebody says, well, I don't want my salary cut. But you might remember that if we don't cut everybody's salary, somebody's probably going to lose the job, and it might be you.
Right.
And so you have to think, do I want to take a little salary cut, or do I want the possibility that I might not even have a job?
This whole mental attitude of bailing out or, you know, saving somebody from themselves, if you will. We just had 2 new grandbabies born, and the sad thing that bothered me was by the time they left the hospital, they had a Social Security number, and they had a bill that they're not even aware of that their children are going to be paying on. Seriously, you know, and you start looking at trillions of dollars, and you can't even get your arms around that. We're spending our children, our children's children, people we'll never meet. We're spending them into oblivion right now. And even though we're trying to cut back, things keep growing, and that's kind of an interesting thing about government, isn't it?
And we're budgeting based on what we have. We cannot budget based on what we expect this, quote, stimulus package is, because we don't know what that is. So.
And the stimulus is only one-time money, so we shouldn't be using that to budget anyway. Even if we receive millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, it shouldn't be for budgeting. It should be for one-time expenses. You know, there's only one silver lining right now this year, and it's that everyone, I think, realizes that we're in dire straits and that we need to make a difference, and we need to do things differently than we have done in the past. What I hope and I pray, Darrell, is that the budgeting committee does look at the way we're doing things, because we cannot just cut back and then promise to these agencies that we're going to make them whole again. What we should be looking at right now is we should be looking at ways that we can do things more efficiently, more effectively, that we can look at ways that we can actually cut the growth of government, because that is what's killing us all. It's clearly killing us nationally, where they can print any amount of money that they want. We're supposed to be a conservative legislature, and I hope that we can look at ways to provide services, but to really look at what is the proper use of government funds.
And the proper role of government, because as you were talking about, we can't promise these agencies. How about looking as representatives what you're promising your constituents? We do have a constitution in our state and in our United States, and it all has to do with the people. We the people. When we start becoming so concerned over the employees of the state and whether, you know, they're going to have to take a cut back, there are people out there in the workaday world that are going to work every day that don't know whether they're going to have a job tomorrow. They would happily cut back to a 4-day week. They would happily take a couple weeks off without pay to keep their jobs. They don't always have that choice. And they're your constituents, and I think that as we look at this problem, the whole picture says that we're all in this together. We're all going to have to bite the bullet and tighten our belts. But if we're not allowed to do that, what we're doing is unconscionable to future generations.
And I can assure you, Raul and Elizabeth both, that we are are looking at every agency and looking at different things. And I think, what the governor has talked about his zero-based budgeting, and I have a different term for it based on what he is talking about, and I really think it's statute-based budgeting is what it is. And we are looking at these agencies and what are you doing and how much of that is required by statutes, how much of it's required by rules, or what is some of this stuff that's been added on that really is not required by the statutes. And we have an opportunity to do exactly what Raul is talking about, to look at our government and find out, okay, what is the role of government? What services should we be providing? People help themselves. Is what they should be doing.
And what happened to the fact that the role of government was to protect rights, not to be providers of privilege or to be providers of everything. And I think that's another consideration, that people really are very resilient, and they just want to know that they can feed their families. So, well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for being here. It's been wonderful to have you tell us what's going on and what you're working on. For those of you who are listening, if you can see a video of this entire program and of previous programs by going to www.idaholibertywatch.com. That's idaholibertywatch.com. You'll have links to the legislature. You'll be able to see this program and other programs. We'll be here next week. My guest will be Representative Joanne Wood. Till then, I'm Elizabeth Allan Hodge. The program is Legislative Watch.